She was never quite sure how it had got started. Well, if she was honest with herself, then she would have to say it was almost entirely her Aunt Noriko's fault. A suggestion that would have probably given the woman a stroke, but nonetheless, it had been the fact that she always bitched and complained about the ninjas that came to her hostel that had sparked the original thought. Those damned ninjas. Trekking in mud and blood and Kami knows what else. Filthy, violent barbarians, the lot of them. And those kunoichis. I have no doubt they can kill a man, but could they cook for one? Clean for one? Yet they swan around in clothes a whore would be ashamed to be seen in, taking the attention of good men. That was usually the point that Hikari tuned her aunt out. Aunt Noriko had been disappointed in love when she was Hikari's age, when the man she had had an understanding with had decided to marry a kunoichi instead. But of all of her aunt's vitriol, it was the comments about ninjas being dirty that stuck with Hikari. Now, let it be said, Hikari had a completely different opinion about ninja to her aunt. For a start, her little brother Masaru was a ninja, and she was damned proud of him for managing it. If it had been up to her, she would have probably graduated the academy herself. But the Kyuubi had killed that dream before she really had it. She'd been 8 years old when the demon fox had attacked Konoha, and she had been lost by her elder sister in the fracas. When they had found her, a day later, she had been pinned under rubble. Her leg had been practically pulverized, and so the med nin had been forced to amputate just above her knee. But she had never forgotten the feeling of relief she had felt when a Hyuga had spotted her and directed a squadron of genin to dig her out. One of those genin had ended up her brother-in-law, as her sister, tearful and grateful, had struck up a friendship that had lasted years before the friendship based on gratitude had changed to romance. Even if he hadn't been her rescuer, Hikari knew she would have liked Akamichi Soda. As it was, Soda had eventually fallen in love with her sister's way with dumplings, as much as her sweet nature. Hikari, however, knew that a sweet nature was a trait that she didn't share with her sister. A combination of unrelenting phantom pains and a dislike of anyone who pitied her had taught her the joys of sarcasm at an early age, not to mention a healthy disrespect for anyone who tried to make things easier for her. It hadn't taken her long to learn her limits, and the first few who had tried to pander to them had underestimated her, and thus thwarted her intentions to try and live, rather than just survive. Her mother had been the first to cotton on. Leave Hikari be, she'd told Hikari's grandmother, who had been miffed at the then 5-year-old telling her that she could go to school because there was nothing wrong with her brain. If she wants help, she'll ask for it. She knows her limits, and the school isn't so far that she can't hobble over there. Her grandmother had retorted that it wasn't the distance that worried her, it was the response of the other students to her maimed granddaughter. She need not have worried. The first kid to refer to Hikari as hop along to her face got the butt of her crutch to his. If it hadn't been for her obvious disability, that fight, and the 7 that followed it would have been enough to get her sent from the civilian school to the academy. Her teacher, Takeshi-sensei, said this to her face with a sniff, telling her that if she couldn't behave, then Hikari was going to have to learn from home, seeing as the academy had decided that there was no point in training a cripple. That was the last time a fight happened at school, but it quickly became well known that if you tormented Hikari, she would get even, one way or another. The nickname, hop along, stuck, but never to Hikari's face. After Takeshi-sensei ended up having her bed infested with maggots, no one dared call her a cripple, either. Hikari had never admitted how she had managed to do that one, but people found it more than a little suspicious that her distinctive crutch print was found in the dirt not far from Takeshi's back door. Later, when her sister was working in one of the Akamichi restaurants along with her sisters and brothers-in-law, it became known that spreading the name to them was a good way to get yourself banned from a particularly tasty source of dango. It was when she had been sitting, eating some of said dango, her crutch propped up against the side of the table when she had heard the conversation that made her act on the half-formed idea that she had been considering since the last time her Aunt Noriko had ranted about ninjas and their cleanliness. I mean, it's not that I particularly mind long-term missions. I get to see foreign places, sleep with foreign women. But coming home to a dusty apartment is always such a complete fucking pain. It's alright for you too, even if you weren't part of clans, you've got wives. It's loners like me that get back from a mission and have nothing to greet us but dust and mold and the remains of whatever got forgotten in the fridge last time. Hikari turned to see Shiranui Genma sitting with Yamashiro Aoba, Nara Shikaku and Akamichi Shuza. and how she hadn't noticed him come in. She would never know what with his immense size and bright red hair it was hard to miss that profile, enjoying a few plates of dumplings. Shiranui had been the one speaking, the senbon needle that was habitually in his mouth flicking around on particular words. Yamashiro scowled, the light streaming through the window shining off his sunglasses. You think you have it bad? I came back after a week-long mission and realized some punk kid had broken one of my windows. It rained for 3 days. 3 mint condition Icha completely ruined. Later, she would swear that her speaking up had been almost involuntary. The truth was, she blurted out something she had been thinking about for a while. I could help you with that, she said. The 3 ninja spun to stare at her. Shiranui looked her up and down, surprised. Help Aoba with what, precisely? He asked finally. You got a source for Icha? Hikari blushed and scowled as the men started laughing at her. No, she said with exaggerated patience. I could look after your houses for you. When you're away on long missions. Or hell, even when you're posted around here and can't be bothered to pick up after yourselves. I'm going into business, she blurted out brazenly. Yamashiro Aoba snorted. If you think we're just going to let some random civilian inside our houses, then you have another thing coming, lady. You're Soriyama Hikari, aren't you? Heads turned to see it was Akamichi Shuza, the head of the Akamichi clan speaking. Your sister makes good dumplings. Hikari smiled at him. She'll be flattered to hear you say so, Akamichi-sama, she said with a slight bow. Nara Shikaku turned to his friend as though to say something, paused, and then examined Hikari with lazy eyes. Ah, so you're Akamichi Natsuko's little sister who got caught under the rubble when Kyuubi attacked, yes? Hi, she said simply, reaching over to grab her crutch and standing up. She had little doubt the 4 of them had spotted the crutch immediately. They were ninja after all. She stood tall, leaning as little on her crutch as possible, and looked the 4 of them in the eyes. My name is Soriyama Hikari, I am 16 years old, and a civilian. I attended the academy for 2 years before the Kyuubi incident, an incident that killed my father and took my leg. My younger brother, Masaru, is currently a genin on the team led by Minami Rei. My elder sister, as you might have gathered, works here, and is married to Akamichi Soda. My mother is ill. The doctor says she might recover if we pay up for some expensive medicine. Akamichi Shuza started a little at that. That's what that money Soda wants to borrow is for. Hikari shrugged. I am unaware of any plans that he and my sister might have. All I know is that I want to do my part. I'm a cripple, she said bluntly. And I have no desire to live on charity. So I have to work. I've spotted what I think could be a niche market that I can fit into. Ninja go off on long-haul missions all the time. It's alright if you live in a clan, but if you live alone, then you have to trust your neighbors to water your plants, assuming that you do indeed actually trust your neighbors. She paused, and let them mull that over for a minute. Suddenly, Shiranui started laughing. Kami, you've got some balls on you, girl. Hikari resisted the urge to roll her eyes. She didn't see what gender had to do with anything. I'd be willing to set up a contract. For a set rate, I'd keep plants and pets alive and the house livable in. Anything I might find in said house would be kept strictly confidential, under pain of the laws of divulging equivalently ranked secrets. Personal information that does not pertain to missions that I might stumble across I would put under a rank on the contract. Shiranui stopped laughing. You're serious? Nara raised an eyebrow. A ranked? You do know what the punishment for violating an A- ranked secret is, right? Interrogation and then imprisonment, Hikari said promptly, doing her best to keep a level tone. But I have no intention of breaking confidentiality, so I have nothing to worry about. I'm not a gossip, and I have a healthy respect for what you ninjas do around here. Something a lot of civilians seem to forget is that we wouldn't be living half so comfortable if it wasn't for shinobi putting themselves on the line. If it hadn't been for the Yondaime Hokage, this village wouldn't even exist. If it hadn't been for the Hyuga that found me, I might have died under that rubble before the genin dug me out. But apart from that, and here Hikari allowed them to see her sheepish grin, I really need the cash. It'd be dumb to jeopardize my source of income by bandying about who exactly has limited edition Icha novels. At that last, Shiranui and Yamashiro started laughing, Akamichi looked amused, and Nara looked thoughtful. Alright, Nara said. Everyone else stared at him. Hikari fumbled. Alright, what? Nara shrugged lazily, but Hikari suddenly felt like a bug under a microscope. I think your idea has a bit of merit. So, I suggest a trial run. If you can disinfect Genma's apartment for him in 24 hours, I'll recommend your services to people I know often get sent on the long-term missions. Hey, Genma protested, nearly spitting out his senbon needle in surprise. Why my apartment? Nara smirked. If she can disinfect that pile, then everyone else's place should be a breeze for her. Hikari smiled and bowed. Thank you so much. Just give me the address and the time you want me to visit, and I'll come with supplies. She frowned for an instant, a thought occurring to her. Are there any traps I should know about? Genma shrugged negligently. A few on the entrances, but I'll disable them for you before you go in. He wasn't sure how he felt about Nara Shikaku inviting some stranger into his house, but her sister had apparently married into the Akamichis, and she seemed determined enough. Maybe she'd be able to finally answer the question that had been bugging him for a while now, since he had realized he'd forgotten the answer years ago. What color was his carpet? Hikari was nervous. She would have bitten off the head of anyone who had suggested that she might be, but it was the Kami honest truth. She hadn't missed the tone of Nara Shikaku's voice when he had talked about the condition of Shiranui Genma's apartment, and so had packed heavily when it came to cleaning supplies. In her hand trolley that she was able to drag along in one hand as she wielded her crutch with the other, along with a sturdy mop, broom and duster, she also had as many cleaning cloths and garbage bags as she could justify being stuffed inside, as well as a few liters of heavy-duty bleach, sink decocker and air freshener, as well as a few other odds and sods that she decided could come in handy. Just in case, she also had a small toolbox that included hammer, screwdriver set and a small handsaw. One ninja lesson that she remembered from her brief time at the academy that had stuck with her for always was that there was no such thing as being over-prepared, and to expect that any plan would go completely to hell when in contact with the enemy. Well, she was pretty sure that wasn't the official wording, and the enemy, in this case, was a slovenly Jonin. But the point was that there was no way in hell she was going to fail because she hadn't packed enough supplies. She needed this. This was her first test that she needed to ace if she wanted to get her business off the ground, and she would get this apartment cleaned up in 24 hours or die trying. When she reached the apartment, she was slightly surprised that all of the men who had been in the Akamichi restaurant, plus a few others, had decided to play spectator and were clustered outside. Some of the legends of the village had joined the group: Hitaki Kakashi, Sarutobi Asuma, and even to her disbelief, Morino Ibiki. Now that was a nasty shock. Still, if she backed down now, then she would never forgive herself, so she gripped her crutch until her knuckles turned white and stepped forward. She nodded a greeting to the group in general, and then proceeded to ignore every one of them bar Genma. Have you disabled all of the traps that I'm likely to stumble on? She asked him. Sure thing, he said. Something in his voice made her a little suspicious, so she decided to test his assertion. She unlatched the door, and then pushed it open with her crutch, careful to stay in the lee of the doorframe. An instant later, senbon were impaling the ground where a normal person might have stood to open the door. Hikari looked at them blankly, and then back up at Genma, who looked entirely unsurprised by this. Fuck you, Shiranui, Hikari hissed at him. I assumed that was a test. Since you have so many witnesses that can confirm I passed, how about you do your part and disengage the traps that I assume are still engaged in the doors and windows? Or would you prefer to instead tell me where they are and how to engage them? And how do you plan on getting inside the homes of ninjas who are away when you cannot surpass their traps? Morino Ibiki rumbled, as Genma spat his senbon needle at a crack in the lintel and then casually strolled inside. Hikari turned slowly to face him. If the traps are chakra-based, then I would obviously have to be keyed into them. If they are mechanical, then there will have to be compromises made. Either the ninja would have to tell me how to activate a disengage sequence, which does not necessarily mean that I would be aware of the nature of the trap, or they would have to tell me the places where I could not go. These conditions would be stipulated in the contract, with the specific details of the traps either passed on through word of mouth or on paper to be immediately destroyed after I had memorized the conditions. Another alternative would be nominating another off-duty nin to let me in. Said nin could then go about their business, and I would then leave them to re-engage the traps upon me leaving. Hikari took a deep breath, and tried to hide her shaking hands. Today is different, because Shiranui is right here, and we haven't signed an official contract. The official contract will have clauses to protect me from undisclosed traps or surprise uninformed house guests. If I'm going to be electing myself to be held to a ranked justice in case of confidentiality breach when it comes to personal effects, then I want some protection from absent-minded paranoia. That last comment actually provoked a snort from Hitaki Kakashi. It's not paranoia if they're out to get you, he said lightly. Hikari stood her ground. I'm a one-legged civilian cleaning lady, whose younger brother is a genin, whose elder sister is married to an Akamichi, and whose family has been in the village for 3 generations. I could give less of a damn about politics unless they directly pertain to me, and I have been the target of enough gossip to have a healthy loathing of it. I'm loyal to the village, have zero ties to forces outside of it, and I have this crazy feeling that even on an off day most of you could beat me in a running race, she finished dryly. I'm not really asking anyone to trust me any more than you might trust the village locksmith, or the chefs and waiters at any of the restaurants you eat at. I mean, I figure that's why there are so many Akamichi restaurants, right? She asked, looking to Akamichi Shuza for confirmation. Your clan's got a good enough reputation for loving food and being loyal to the village that I'd reckon only the most paranoid ninja wouldn't relax in your establishments. Akamichi Shuza looked taken aback for a moment, and then began to laugh. You're not far off, he admitted, privately thinking that he was going to have to get to know young Soda's wife a bit better. If she was even half as sharp as her sister, then she was wasted as a mere dumpling maker. Not that he was going to stop her from making them, that woman was skilled, but maybe he might drop a message to his cousin Shuba to teach her some management or something. If we trusted the village locksmith, Ibiki drawled, letting out a smidgen of killing intent, then we wouldn't need the traps. Hikari didn't bother to hide her eye roll. With all due respect, that's bullshit. You trust the locksmith to keep the civilians out. Otherwise, why would you bother with a commercial deadlock or security mesh? The traps are for friendly ninja with no respect for locks, and enemies, 2 sets of beings that need a bit of a firmer fuck off than a doorknob that won't turn. For a moment, there was dead silence. Then Genma, who had apparently finished disabling his traps, spoke up from where he was leaning against the doorframe. What did I tell you guys? Balls of fucking steel. A few snickers came out, and the tension quickly diffused. Hikari limped over to the door, looked in, saw the mess, and then counted to 10. Then, for good measure, she counted to 20. Shiranui-san, she said with exaggerated politeness, when was the last time you saw your floor? Ah. Genma smiled sheepishly and scratched the back of his head. Try about a week after he moved in 6 years ago, snorted Aoba. Kakashi looked in with interest. So this is why poker night is never at your place. And why you insist that it's good policy to go home to her house. If you took any of your one-night stands here, they'd run away screaming. Genma just shrugged. Hikari counted to 10 again, and then turned to look Genma in the eye. I'm half tempted to just set fire to the lot of it, but that would mean that the ground beneath that toxic sludge pile would never again be fertile. And I don't back down from challenges. She breathed in, and then regretted it. Kami, Shiranui, do Inazukas take a detour to avoid this place? She asked, as she pulled her scarf from her head and then retied it over her nose and mouth. How much of this stuff do you want to? She cut herself off. Stupid question. You probably have no idea what's buried below about the first 10 centimeters. This is going to be like an archaeological dig. She turned to Akamichi Shuza and bowed. Akamichi-sama, if I am never seen again, tell my sister that I love her, my brother to practice harder at his chakra control, and my mother that she's allowed to say, I told you so. All of my worldly possessions are to be split between my family and the orphanage. Aunt Noriko can get the ugly vase. Witnessed, drawled Nara Shikaku, who looked as sleepy as ever until you saw the glint of amusement in his eyes. Restraining herself from a retort, after all, this was all Nara's fault, because it wouldn't do to piss off a clan head when she was trying to start a business. Hikari squared her shoulders and got to work. Taking out a garbage bag, the first thing she did was pick out as much of the empty, and some not so empty and growing strange life forms, take out cartons as she could out of the rubble. She had half filled her 6th garbage bag before she was satisfied that that part at least was sufficiently done so that she could start sorting out the less obvious garbage from the detritus of scrolls, items of soiled clothing, and random weapons. Most of the latter were senbon, and after she found the 5th of these in about 3 minutes, she started sticking them in an empty shoebox that she dug from the pile near the mostly empty bookshelf. 4 hours later, and the bookshelf was full. She'd filled the shoebox and a beer carton with senbon needles and assorted kunai and shuriken. There was a pile of torn, filthy, blood, food, and she didn't want to even know what else stained clothing that was as tall as her head. The clean, clothing was folded and stowed in a corner until she managed to get deeper inside. To her surprise, the flooring was actually some rather nice wooden floorboards that only needed a bit of a scrub before she knew they'd be shining. Well, first she needed to sort out the clothes, or maybe, she grinned. Oi, Genma. She poked her head out the door to see that Genma and Aoba were playing cards outside. The other shinobi had apparently since gotten bored of the spectacle of hearing her swear occasionally when she found something particularly new and horrifying. Some of those bacteria cultures were so developed she'd be unsurprised if they developed languages and religion. She wondered idly if that made her that thing that her grandmother had once told her that really old story about. Riguna something, whatever. Yes? He asked her, waggling his senbon at her cheekily. There is quite a pile of blood, and I use that term euphemistically, stained clothing in here. Do you want to try and save some of it, or would you rather I just chuck it all in the skip? Genma considered, and then shrugged. I've replaced most of that stuff anyway, so I guess just chuck it. Hikari bit her lip, shifting on her crutch for a moment. What? Genma demanded. Well, Hikari paused, and then smiled. My mother belongs to a patchwork sewing circle. Once the stains are cut out, there'd be quite a bit of usable cloth there still. Genma and Aoba just stared at her. You know what? Whatever. I won't miss it anyway, Genma said, waving one of his hands negligently as he turned back to his cards. Hikari shrugged. All right, and then proceeded to sort all of the stained clothing into 2 sets of bags. The stuff that was completely irredeemable, that smelled poisonous, or was in shreds she was going to just throw out, but the bits that would be fine except for the occasional stab stain, rent, those she was going to ask her mother about. The Soriyama family had never been rich, and waste not want not was practically tattooed to her psyche. She didn't know what she would use the material for, but she'd do something with it. An hour later, and the sun began to go down. Aoba stuck his head around the door to let her know that the two of them were heading to a bar, and whistled. Where there had been layers of detritus, now there were neat lines of garbage bags and a few boxes of weapons. Fuck me, she might actually manage to do it, he muttered to Genma as they left. Yeah? Genma asked, surprised. The best I was hoping for was to learn what color my carpet was. Aoba snorted. Dude, you don't have carpet. You have floorboards. Genma stopped dead. Seriously? He asked. Aoba just shook his head. You're pathetic. Genma ignored him and smiled. Floorboards. It's been bugging me for months. Back at the apartment, and Hikari had made it to the kitchen. To her relief, apart from a forest of dirty chopsticks and a couple of coffee mugs, there was little washing up to do. Apparently Genma never used anything but the fridge and the microwave, as other than a thick coating of dust, the stove and oven were practically pristine. The layers were less deep in here, and it only took her half an hour to fill some more garbage bags until all of the visible surfaces were clear. Then she opened the fridge. And promptly shut it again. Then slowly opened it again, hoping that she had been hallucinating. She hadn't been. The first thing to hit her was the stench. The rest of the apartment so far had been bad, but for the most part the fragments of food that had mutated had been just that, fragments. Some of it had been so old it had been mummified, so it hadn't even smelled that bad. The aroma coming from the fridge was enough to make her hair frizzle. She didn't even want to know what it would have been like at room temperature. The second thing that hit her was the teetering stack of half-eaten fast food cartons. I wonder, she muttered to herself disgustedly as she wiped half-congealed green and brown sauce from her top, if Shiranui is in fact immune to poison. If he actually planned on eating any of this, then he would have to be. Screw it, she was saving the stupid idiot from imminent food poisoning. She didn't care if there was anything edible left in there, it was all getting chucked out. For the first time since she had started, she dragged one of Genma's garbage bins directly into the house, and then, having taken a perch on a low stool she had uncovered, squatting was next to impossible to balance with her wooden leg, and kneeling was a pain to rise from without a helping hand or a convenient low handrail or something like she had set up at her bath at home. Not to mention that the prosthetic didn't have a knee joint, so, kneeling was only a comparative term. Proceeded to load the entire contents of the fridge into the bags. I wonder what that vivid purple mold grew out of, she thought idly as she threw jars, cartons and bottles indiscriminately into the bin. Right at the back of the last shelf, she found a seemingly untouched six-pack of beer. She checked the use-by date, and was delighted to see that it was still good. She levered herself up on her crutch and dropped the beer on the dusty counter, and then proceeded to thoroughly disinfect the fridge. Considering the depth and texture of some of the growths inside, she wondered if she should perhaps consider an exorcism. Maybe she'd burn some incense in here after she was done. That was something she was going to have to consider, she thought. Smell. If she ever ended up doing any Inuzuka homes or something, then she was going to have to make sure she either used the harsher cleaning agents enough days in advance that the smell wore off, as adding a smell like incense or air freshener would probably only make it worse for a sensitive Inuzuka nose. Or maybe she should get an industrial fan to blow the smells out the windows or something. Hell, maybe she should just cook a roast. That would probably be enough to infuse the house with not bleach smell. And she couldn't imagine the Inuzukas having any particular problems with their houses smelling like cooked meat. Unless they liked it completely rare, like in the rumors. Hikari supposed that she would have to ask someone. The fridge done, Hikari then proceeded to clean out the microwave, which was somewhat splattered, but mercifully not growing things inside, and then decided that now was a good time to brave the bathroom. To her surprise, apart from the thick patina of soap scum in the sink and shower, and the thick layer of muddy dust and spiderwebs, this room at least was fairly clean. There was a yellow mummified cake of soap sludge in the soap holder, and mushrooms growing in one corner where there seemed to be a leak in the shower, but... Okay, so it was pretty filthy by normal standards, but compared to the rest of the house? It was bearable, and therefore comparatively easy, although she did have to get on her hands and knees to scrub at some of the areas that her mop couldn't reach properly. Fortunately, she was able to pull herself up via the sink, otherwise it would have been a pain. It was a little past midnight by now, but Hikari was determined to see this to the finish. She opened the door to the bedroom, and then nearly started crying. With relieved laughter, that was. Apart from a thick layer of dust that covered the futon, desk and houseplant, the room was practically empty. It was a bizarre minimalist contrast to the labyrinthine morass that had been in the rest of the apartment. As she looked over at the window, she could see dirt tracks on the windowsill that showed that here was the primary entrance to Genma's small apartment cum tip. Well, I guess this explains how the hell he could live in this shit heap. Somehow he's managed to keep here mostly clear, she muttered to herself as she began to dust and sweep out the mess. There was a built-in wardrobe in the corner that she studiously ignored. The chances of it being trapped were high, but even higher was the likelihood of everything inside it falling all over the floor and undoing her work. She decided that if Genma complained, then she'd just tell him she wanted to err on the side of not snooping. As she went to wash the mud off the windowsill though, something made Hikari pause. She poked her crutch in the general direction of the window, and then tapped around the frame. Fortunately for Hikari, most of the resultant explosion was aimed out the window. What part of it did reach inside the room though was enough to blow her backwards onto the bed. Son of a bitch, she groaned, coughing slightly from the disturbed dust. Before she could properly sit back up again, 3 animal-masked Anbu were standing in the room. To be more precise, they were looming over her, so that all she could see were the masks of a bull, a lorikeet and a gecko. Warily, she looked up at them, and remembered the first golden rule about dealing with ninja. No sudden movements. She made to sit up, but stopped when they all tensed. Okay then. Hi? She said uncertainly. For some reason, these words were enough to make the shinobi relax. I guess that makes sense, Hikari thought to herself, because if I was a ninja, then I'd probably be either silent or screaming out a jutsu about now. Bull, who seemed to be appropriately masked, because his shoulders were about as broad as Hikari was tall, inclined his head at her. She assumed that that was silent, soiled underwear inspiring ninja speak for, explain. Now, please. She decided to do so. That was the second golden rule. If you like your internal organs where they are, do whatever they want you to do. Okay, so basically, I'm currently trying to win a bet. 3 blank masks stared at her. You see, Anbu-san, Hikari gulped. I want to set up a house-sitting and cleaning business for ninja clients. The problem is, I'm a civilian. So, naturally, I have to prove myself to be up to the task. As you are probably aware, this is Shiranui Genma's house. 3 inclined masks were her only answer. Hikari cleared her throat. Well, so the thing is. The terms of the bet are that I have to make this place clean by tomorrow afternoon. I was given 24 hours. The only condition I requested was that Shiranui-san remove his traps. She growled indignantly and for a moment forgot that she was being silently interrogated by a trio of trained killers. This is the second fucking time. I mean, I get it, okay? You ninja are all completely paranoid. I get it. I assume that it's generally a pretty good survival trait. But goddammit, I am so going to put a life insurance clause into the contract. And possibly start cleaning whilst wearing armor or something. In fact, that's what I'm spending my first paycheck on. I mean, for Cammy's sake, I didn't ask to see where his traps were set so that the info couldn't be interrogated out of me. Seems like a better policy in general. To Hikari's shock, she heard a snicker then. The way 2 of the masks suddenly snapped around to stare at Gecko, she knew that she hadn't been hallucinating. Theoretically she knew that Anbu were people under those masks, but the idea of a member of the Black Ops Special Forces actually laughing was quite disconcerting actually. Bull shook his head, followed by Lorikeet, who explained in exasperated feminine tones. He's new. Ah, Hikari replied uncertainly. There was a significant pause. Hikari then had a thought. I'll strike you a deal? She asked. Bull cracked his knuckles. Gecko stopped snickering. Lorikeet just cocked her head and stared at her. What sort of deal? Hikari slowly sat up, and was happy to note that this time the 3 Anbu didn't go into prepare to neutralize threat mode. Someone could check to see if there are any more unpleasant surprises that I'm likely to uncover, and I won't tell anyone I heard an Anbu laugh. She looked significantly at Gecko, who cringed a little. That would mean all of his street cred would be gone. Gecko disappeared, and then returned, in a swirl of leaves. Damn it, now I have to clean that up too. Hikari moaned. Figuring that since they were actually talking to her, they had probably relaxed, Hikari went to look for her crutch, and then saw the litter of splinters on the floor. Son of a bitch. What? Asked Lorikeet. That piece of shit Shiranui's fucking explosive tag wrecked my crutch, Hikari spat, before dropping her head into her hands. A few moments later, she let out a growl, and then pushed herself into a standing position, then spreading her arms slightly wider than a person normally would, began to hobble about, straightening the bed cover from where she had wrinkled it on impact, and then surveying what she had left to do. Gecko returned in another swirl of leaves, and Hikari barked at him. So, anything I should be worried about? Gecko shook his head. Not unless you were going to try rooting inside any of the cupboards in here. Hikari rolled her eyes. Do I look like that much of an idiot? She growled. Now, I want to know who is going to clean up all these fucking leaves you've just tracked in here with that fucking jutsu. I've got to get this place cleaned, and you just set me back half an hour. Okay, so it was a bit of an exaggeration, and she hadn't swept the floor in here yet, but the Anbu didn't have to know. The detritus from the exploding tag made it hard to tell anyway. Gecko made a noise that Hikari could have sworn was a gulp, before he picked up her broom and efficiently started to sweep everything into a large pile, that Hikari, using her long-handled dustpan, moved to sweep it up, balancing even more carefully on her prosthetic than usual. Gecko saw this, and before she could voice a protest, he had taken over and was lugging the swept-up detritus out to the bin. As soon as he had left the room, Hikari didn't bother to hide the grin. Damn, that was easier than she'd thought it would be. Lorikeet angled her mask at her. You did that on purpose, didn't you? Hikari shrugged and didn't bother to deny it. I want to win this bet. I potentially got my livelihood on the line here. If he wants to help me out of the goodness of his heart because he made my job harder for me, well. Hikari let a half-smile show on her face. If I just so happened to match the typical tones of an overbearing Konoha matron to do it, then I can't help it if your average Konoha teen is particularly susceptible to orders in that tone of voice. Bull whistled lowly, and then spoke in a deep bass voice. That was plain mean for a civilian. You do know we're going to make his life an absolute living hell over this. Hikari shrugged again. Better he learn it with me than on a mission. Bull nodded. Oh, believe me, that kid is going to know about the consequences of falling for a ploy like that. To be fair, that bit with the exaggeration of your limp was nice. I did note you never asked him to do a thing for you, just implied it was his job, and he hopped too, like the green newbie he is. You do alright in T and I with moves like that. Hikari blinked. Thank you, I think. But if this works out, I'm sticking to cleaning ninja houses. That way I get to pick my own hours, she joked. Carefully, she pushed away the half-forgotten ambitions that comment had brought up. She pushed them back ruthlessly, slightly surprised that they still lingered. She'd been forced to give up her dreams of being a ninja when she was 8 years old. Gecko came back then, and handed Hikari back her dustpan and broom. "Thank you," she said with a smile at him, before she turned to face the three Anbu as a group. "Now if the three of you wouldn't mind leaving without tracking leaves back in here, that would be great." There were clear signs of amusement in Lorikeet and Bull's postures as they calmly walked towards the front door, whereas Gecko's shoulders had slumped a little. Hikari smirked, but the realization that she would have to drag all those bags out of the house without her crutch to help her balance quickly wiped all signs of amusement from her face. This was going to be a bitch. It was 10 o'clock the next day when Hikari finally decided she was happy with what she had done. She'd polished the windows, swept and then scrubbed all of the floors, and then opened as many windows as she could and burned a light sandalwood incense in the house to chase out the worst of the smells. She had filled 3 skips with the garbage from inside the apartment, and had had to enlist the aid of a group of schoolkids to find the second 2. Apparently they had thought the whole thing was funny, and had cheered her on as she had made trip after trip carefully balancing 2 bags in a slightly awkward posture as she did her best to keep her center of gravity mostly on her real leg. She'd also procured a large piece of plywood to put over the trap-broken window in the bedroom, though she hadn't nailed it up in case Genma wanted it fixed immediately. If that was the case, she knew a guy who could help him out, but she wanted to wait before she went ahead. After all of her efforts, the house sparkled. She thought longingly of the beer that she had replaced into the fridge, but decided in the end that even if Genma had almost certainly forgotten about it, she would be better off not touching it. It was well-known civilian lore that one did not piss off a ninja, and really, Hikari figured, stealing a ninja's beer was just asking for trouble. Even if she was almost certain he had forgotten about it. 11 o'clock found her sitting on the stool she had found outside the front door sipping iced water and eating sushi rolls from a little shop just down the way. She had been amused to note that it was yet another Akamichi place. This one was manned by one of her nieces, and the girl had been more than happy to give a discount to her, Hikari Obasan, although Hikari's niece was only 2 years younger than Hikari herself. It was at that point, with 3 hours until her deadline, that someone must have mentioned in passing to Genma and his colleagues that there was a civilian camping on his doorstep, because soon afterwards, the same group of curious ninja appeared. Most of them didn't speak to Hikari, and only nodded their heads to her in recognition. Genma when he showed up was less circumspect. "So what, you gave up?" he asked her cheekily. Hikari snorted. "Go in and see for yourself," she said. "By the way, you owe me a crutch." Genma looked mildly confused at this last remark, but walked in nonetheless. If Hikari had been watching Genma's expression as he walked into the house, she would have been amused to note the fact that the normally laconic ninja went slack-jawed. Fortunately, for everyone but Genma, Aoba had decided to record Genma's reactions for posterity, and so managed to get a pretty decent photo. On the other hand, Hikari was able to hear his second reaction. Kai. Hikari rolled her eyes. "It's not a genjutsu," she called out patiently. "Civilian, remember? Well, you could have maybe paid someone to do it." Genma defended himself as his colleagues started to snicker. Nara Shikaku chose that moment to add his comment. "Unlikely, considering that she is ostensibly trying to become solvent through this endeavor," he drawled. He poked his head out the door and looked at Hikari. "So what happened to the bedroom window?" Hikari groaned. "Trap. I assume Genma didn't disarm it because it was pointed outwards. Or maybe he was feeling paranoid. Either way, it disintegrated my crutch. I am the opposite of happy about that, in case you were wondering." Genma laughed sheepishly. "So I'm Genma now. What happened to Shiranui-san?" Hikari smiled sweetly at him. "I turned that tip into an apartment, I exorcised your fridge, and your bedroom window blew my crutch up. I think I get given name rights." Genma winced. "I actually forgot that old thing was there. To be fair, I never said all the traps were gone." Hikari scowled. She might be a civilian, but she wasn't a complete idiot. A ninja just forgetting that he had a trap in an obviously well-used entryway? Police. With the air of someone who is sleep-deprived but nonetheless determined she is in the right, Hikari folded her arms and waited. There was a short, tense silence. Nara Shikaku snorted and observed the standoff through half-lidded eyes. Troublesome. What? Said Genma defensively, raising his hands. What my esteemed colleague is trying to say, Genma, said Yamanaka Inoichi as he sauntered casually out the door, is that you owe the girl. I just so happened to hear about a report submitted by some Anbu who came to check out the disturbance. Your little tag blew her most of the way across the room. Could have taken her civilian head off if she'd been unlucky. Hikari decided that she needed to nip that particular thought in the bud. I wouldn't say luck had anything to do with it. I was cautious approaching any and all ninja entrances, that's why I was poking the trap with my crutch. Looks like my next one will want to be a bit sturdier though, before it ends up as sawdust too. Genma scowled. Fine, I'll pay you enough so you can replace your crutch, he said to Hikari. Hikari snorted. And then some. Nara hired me on your behalf for 24 hours. Even with your first customer discount, you owe me, she named a price. Genma just laughed. And how do you figure that? He said. Hikari smiled. I'm part of the union, she said. Yamanaka raised a blonde eyebrow. So you're one of those Soriyamas, he said. Hikari spread her hands wide. Are there any others? She asked him rhetorically. Genma looked from Yamanaka to Hikari and then back again. What am I missing? He demanded. Nara let out a tch of amusement. You know that tea house in between the bookshop and the kimono place nearest the hot springs? And that stall that sells herbs with the blue awning? And that cute little hostel where the merchants like to stay? They're all Soriyama places. The family has been selling things in Konoha for generations. They're one of Konoha's founding merchant families, so they have a seat on the civilian council. Cousin Wakana. Hikari rolled her eyes. She got the seat because no one else wanted it. At least her business sense isn't as terrible as her sense of humor. And in the civilian union, Nara continued. Genma just looked confused. Yamanaka decided to enlighten him. They're generally pretty quiet, but it's the union that decide and uphold most of the rules when it comes to civilian workers. They're the ones that insisted on there being a strict policy against ninja interfering in civilian business. More significant to you, they also insisted on there being structured minimum wages for various jobs. Yamanaka looked over to Hikari. Which member of your family is the representative for the union? Hikari smiled. Uncle Daiki. I'm his favorite niece. Yamanaka's gaze sharpened. And as his favorite niece, I suppose that you would be able to pass along a message for me and it would be well received. Hikari snorted. As his favorite niece, I can make you an offer he will complain about, but stick to. Rumor has it that your nephew has an uncommon skill for flower arranging and a complete distaste of the idea of being a ninja. Yamanaka jerked his head stiffly. It had been a slight disappointment that his sister's boy had been so firm in his decision to stay in civilian school. Privately, he wondered if the rumor that the choice had been at least partly because the boy hadn't wanted to be compared to his elder cousin Ino had a lot to do with it. Hikari nodded in acknowledgement. If you verbally offer support for my business, and buy pots from Himura-sanji, then I'll tell Uncle Daiki he's sponsoring your nephew Ren. Yamanaka considered for a few moments, his face blank. The girl talked a good fight at least. Not to mention well informed. Sometimes he almost forgot just how efficient the civilian gossip network was. If she was actually able to follow through on her offer, then this could solve a problem that he had been worrying about for a while. One thing though. Why pots from Himura? He asked her. Hikari stood up and stretched. Because Minazaki Yoko, the woman you buy from at the moment, snubbed my cousin Kenji, who happens to be Uncle Daiki's son, and my aunt Toriko was the one to broker the deal between Himura and his current providers of the good red clay. Yamanaka inclined his head as he thought about that. Himura's pots are more expensive than Minazaki's, he said. Himura's pots are better than Minazaki's, Hikari countered. And he tends to give discounts when you buy from him in bulk. His wife loves chrysanthemums, and he has a particular weakness for good quality sake. Yamanaka raised an eyebrow. When she could not make guarantees on the behalf of Himura, she had given him ammunition to soften the old man up before they began dealing. He caught Nara's eye, and from expression, he knew that his longtime teammate and friend was impressed too. Nara did not impress easily. That in itself would have been a fair endorsement, but even without it, her offer was a good one. My endorsement after you organize an introduction between myself, my nephew and your uncle, he told her. Done. Yamanaka stuck out his hand in a civilian gesture of sealing an agreement. Ninja rarely shook hands, as it was far too easy to transfer a contact poison or to grab someone and throw them with such freely allowed contact. At the very least, crushed knuckles were often the outcome of two ninja sharing a handshake, even if they did trust each other enough to engage in one. The fact that Hikari offered her hand unflinchingly showed that she was willing to trust him. The fact that Yamanaka's handshake was firm but not uncomfortably so displayed that he might be a ninja, but he understood about and respected civilian business dealings. The fact that the Yamanaka flower shop was so successful had a lot to do with the fact that they weren't known as the best ninja flower shop in Konoha. They were simply known as the best flower shop, in part because the Yamanakas had always made it a point of pride to be able to deal with civilians. Hikari was pleased to do business with him. Yamanaka turned to look Genma in the eye. "Genma, pay the woman. And include the money for a new crutch. We once offered cleaning your apartment as an A- rank, and we couldn't find any takers. It was considered too cruel even for rookie genin teams." Genma just grinned sheepishly and nodded. He pulled out a checkbook. Lucky he had taken out all of those A ranks recently, otherwise he would have been screwed. Though he was going to save a fortune in hotel fees for the next while or so in retrospect, maybe this was a worthy investment. He looked down at the large box of lost senbon and kunai. Okay, so maybe this had been an extremely worthy investment. 3 minutes later, a glowingly happy Hikari stumped off in the general direction of the bank. She already had plans for the money, the new crutch being the least of it. Ibiki emerged from the shadows. For an imposing man, he was good at being quiet when he wanted to listen, and he had watched the entire exchange. He considered what he had just seen. In a campaign that had been as smooth as one of Nara's shogi matches, the one-legged civilian girl had managed to separately ensure the support of the entirety of the Ino Shika Cho team, and thus by proxy their clans. The good word of 3 well-liked ninja clans was nothing to sniff at. The fact that she had done so by reminding the Akamichi of her family connection, impressing the Nara with her nerve and the Yamanaka with her business acumen showed that the girl had almost certainly thought long and hard before she had stepped forward, spontaneously, in the dumpling stall. Ibiki nodded to himself as he strolled casually back to his offices at T&I. If only because she had provided him with more amusement than he had had in a long time, he would definitely be keeping a close eye on that girl. After all, it wasn't every day he met a civilian with the guts to stand up to him. Hope that wasn't too dull. Should get more interesting with the next couple of chapters, now that I'm done with establishing Hikari's business. Next chapter. Clean, green fighting machine. After news of Hikari's success with Shiranui Genma's house, an event that was described as a search and destroy mission, in which the search was for the floor, and the destroy referred to practically everything that Hikari had encountered on the way to it. Offers for Hikari's services started to, if not flood, then at least trickle in at a rate steady enough that she was kept busy. As it turned out, most of the ninja above genin were too paranoid to let her into their houses unsupervised, but this did not particularly bother Hikari. At least then she had someone to talk to as she toiled her way through, excavating the deep layers of what she euphemistically termed accumulated, ninja dirt. Some of the substances that made up ninja dirt were such that Hikari not only did not want to know, she had a feeling if she knew any specifics, then they would have to put her under an even stronger vow of secrecy than was stipulated in her contract. Getting the contract itself drawn up had been quite an interesting exercise. Her cousin Sachiko worked with the union's legal department, and so through her, Hikari was introduced to Cheikawa Obito, a man who was well known for being able to draw up contracts that both civilians and ninja could be happy with. He was often the first stop for civilian merchants who wanted a ninja escort for their caravans. Irritatingly for Hikari, before he would rid her the contract, she had to convince him that she knew what she was doing. The first time he told her she should go home and think about it, she was annoyed, but kept her temper. When he suggested that she marry to provide her family with money, she was absolutely livid. "First of all, you are not my father nor my clan leader, Cheikawa-san, so with all due respect, what I do with my personal life is none of your demon's cursed business. Secondly, even if it was, I might be a plain, blunt-mouthed, civilian cripple." Cheikawa had the grace to wince at the direct quotation of something that his ex-kunoichi wife had said about Hikari at a social event 3 months ago whilst 3 sheets to the wind, "But that doesn't make me stupid. I've already had to replace a crutch from the test run, and I cleaned Shiranui Genma's apartment. At this point, Cheikawa's eyebrows shot up. He had heard rumors through his wife to that effect, but had privately doubted them. He had known Shiranui Genma's mother quite well, and so had a fair idea of the complete and utter non-existence of any housekeeping skills that the ninja had. Kami knew his poor mother Akane had railed about it enough. "I know exactly what I am getting myself into," Hikari had stressed. "So are you going to write this contract for me, or am I going to have to pass on to someone with lesser talents because you are too concerned for my well-being?" She practically spat. Fortunately for Hikari, Cheikawa had been mostly just testing her. Being married to an ex-kunoichi missing her right arm to the elbow from a particularly brutal opponent in the grass Chunin exams 20 years ago meant that Cheikawa was well informed of some of the serious cultural clashes that could come from misunderstandings between civilians and ninja, even within a ninja village like Konoha. The fact that even whilst nettled, Hikari had acknowledged that he was the best at what he did had given him confidence that the girl could keep her head in an emotional situation. This skill was important for civilians conducting business, but it was twice as important when dealing with ninjas. The worst thing that could happen if you forgot who you were talking to a civilian was likely to be shunning from some quarters and the collapse of a few business deals. The worst thing that could happen with a ninja, particularly considering factors such as battle fatigue and the occasional ninja who just went stark raving crazy over something like respect, would be a maiming. And considering the girl was already missing a leg, it wasn't as though she really had limbs to spare. Cheikawa, looking at Hikari, saw a girl who had learned at a young age that she was physically incapable of running away from danger at any sort of respectable pace. Instead of this reinforcing a sense of her own helplessness though, Hikari had taken the limitation in stride. With flight restricted, Hikari was left with fight or neutralize. Not stupid, indeed. Cheikawa had seen how she had avoided conflict to begin with, but how she had likewise stood strong when it became clear that he was going to put her off otherwise. She reminded him a little of his not-so-delicate flower Kimiko, who taught the little girls at the academy skills that meant if their careers were cut short like hers had been, they would be able to still make a living beyond the pension that all ninja who survived career-ending injuries were entitled to. As a mark of the respect that Sorayama Hikari had evoked in him, Cheikawa had made the unusual move of personally delivering the contract to the Hokage instead of handing it off to a clerk. Cheikawa, what a pleasant surprise. Sarutobi Hiruzen, the Sandaime Hokage had greeted him. The Hokage had not appeared surprised at all. Despite himself, Cheikawa grinned just a little. "So how long were you practicing that in the mirror before I turned up, monkey?" Unseen to Cheikawa, one of the anbu hidden in the office nearly fell off the ceiling at the old civilian's casualness in front of the Hokage. Naturally, the three other anbu in the office all saw, as did the Hokage, and as a result all four very pointedly never mentioned it in a way that meant that whenever Ocelot saw them, he knew exactly what they were remembering. The two old friends sat down to hash out the details over a little sake. When Cheikawa left several hours later, the Hokage settled back in his chair with a smile. It was good to catch up with old friends. Especially, when they could remember embarrassing things about his childhood. Something that in retrospect perhaps should not have surprised Hikari was that the bulk of her repeat customers were not necessarily those who were going on long-term missions. She commented on as much to Aoba when she was mopping his bathroom floor, and he informed her that that was Ibiki's doing. If the mission is supposed to be a secret, then you don't want spies to pick up on the fact that whoever has called in the cleaner is about to go on a long-haul mission. Too much of a tell. Quite aside from foreign problems, the last thing we want to do is make hiring you be a tell for a house that is about to be empty. Some smart-ass civilian burglar might be given the mistaken impression that the places will be easy pickings, and then you'd be cleaning up bodies. Hikari just stared at the sunglasses wearing Jonin. "Huh," was all she replied. Later, as she stumped home with her cleaning supplies dragging behind her in a small handcart, she wondered if ninjas ever got paranoia migraines. It might explain some things. Then again, there were other good reasons why they might have migraines. She could hear one of them coming now. "Yosh, is this not a most wonderful day to be feeling youthful? I will do 30 laps of the village on my hands to celebrate, and if I cannot do that, I will do 300 one-handed push-ups whilst balanced on the river." Hikari sidestepped just in time to avoid a collision as a green blur came speeding around the corner. The green blur moved 20 meters past her, and then backtracked at a slightly more sedate rate. "Good lady." I apologize for my youthful speed almost causing you an unyouthful injury. Hikari looked down at the upside-down face with the thick shaggy eyebrows and noticed that he was bare-handed. For a moment, she considered the amount of dirt, broken glass, sharp rocks and such like that those hands had probably been walking through, and decided that if he ever offered one to her, she would demand he washed it first. Other than that though, "So, how thick is the callus on your palms?" she asked him. "Can you even feel textures with your fingers anymore?" The man shrugged, making it look like he was doing a handstand push-up. "If I wish to feel textures, then I must use some other part of my body, for my hands are my weapons, much as my feet, knees and elbows are my weapons." "Why do you ask?" Hikari shrugged. "I just wondered. I noticed that you weren't wearing gloves and figured this was probably more than just muscle training for you. I suppose this way you don't have to go around slapping walls, and you get the benefit of using your entire body as a weight set." The sudden dazzling sunny grin nearly made Hikari leap back in surprise. There was so much personality in that grin. Idly, she wondered how much of it was natural charisma and how much was a genjutsu. At least some of it had to be genjutsu, because otherwise she was looking at a fully grown man leaving a trail of glitter in the air. Then again, ninja could be pretty weird sometimes. Though this particular man was famous for his weirdness. Even if she was not in the habit of keeping up with gossip, Hikari would have heard this guy every day, bellowing his famous speeches about youth, vitality, and insane training regimes as he went along. If there was something that made a guy, Konoha's green beast habitually wasn't, it was quiet and unnoticeable. "So," Hikari said, "when am I going to pay a house call to Konoha's green beast?" Guy looked a little confused, but then looked her up and down. Hikari could practically hear the moment when the penny dropped. "Ah, you are Soriyama Hikari, the young girl who has started the ninja cleaning business." Hikari snorted. "Young girl my ass. You'd been a chunin for 6 years already when you were my age. And don't give me that crap about ninja versus civilian years. I haven't been a child since Kyuubi knocked a house on my leg." Guy cocked his head. "Oh, I thought you were 16? He didn't ask how she knew that he had become chunin at 11. It was common enough knowledge if you paid attention to such things. For similar reasons Hikari didn't bother to ask him how he knew her age and shook her head. 17. My birthday was 3 days ago. Guy grinned at her, still upside down. Well, happy belated birthday then. Hikari just shrugged. She usually ignored her birthday, and this year, with her mother sick, her brother busy studying for his academy exams and her sister working mad hours at the dumpling shop, it had gone by even less remarked than usual. But I must say that I did not mean to offend you. Quite the opposite in fact. You should be glad that you are still a flower of youthfulness. Despite herself, Hikari burst out laughing at his words. Flower? No one has compared me to a flower before. Maybe one of those hard to get rid of weeds. They flower sometimes, she considered. Come to think of it, I think I'd rather be irritating and hardy than a delicate blossom that will fade away with the first frost. Guy seemed to consider that. What about lotuses? He asked her. They are both hardy and pretty to look at. Hikari shrugged. But they can only flourish in still water, and I've never enjoyed being coddled like that. She considered for a moment. Actually, I think I'd rather be some sort of thorny vine like a bougainvillea or something. Hardy, and will make you bleed if you mess with it. Hikari shook her head. How did we even get onto this subject? You still haven't answered my question. When are you going to book my services for your house? Guy smiled at her. Not for a while, my beautiful bougainvillea. I have been put on forced leave for 2 more weeks, and so long as I am inside it, my home is always kept up to the highest standards of cleanliness. Hikari raised an eyebrow. If that's the case, then I'm surprised. I saw Kakashi's place last week and by Kami, I thought his carpet was gray until I realized it was all the dust. To her amusement, Guy became particularly excited by this. Yosh, I have defeated my rival in the challenge of keeping a better household. Hikari stifled a snicker. Oh no, don't tell him I told you. He might claim I violated the confidentiality clause, she said deadpan. To her surprise, Guy suddenly became extremely serious. Very well, he shall never know it was you who told me. My lips are sealed. Before Hikari could adjust to this spectacle of a serious guy, youthful Guy returned with a sparkling grin. But now I shall challenge him to have a cleaner house, and the fact that I already know he is behind shall be our secret. Until next time, my beautiful bougainvillea. With a wink and a thumbs up, Guy left in a blur of green and a cloud of dust, still upside down and balanced on his hands. Hikari stared after him for a moment, then picked up her cart and carried onward. She had a job to do, and no amount of crazy ninja with blinding smiles were going to distract her from it. Even if he did call her beautiful. Hikari had been established as the ninja cleaning lady for a good 7 months the first time she met the demon container. She had encountered him before, of course. With his vivid blonde hair, so like the Yondaimes, she had always thought privately, it seemed the fox had a sick sense of humor, and his general penchants for wearing vivid orange and causing mayhem, it was hard not to spot him every once in a while. Especially since pretty much everyone who did encounter him tended to rave on and on about how much of a nuisance he was, and occasionally whisper darkly what they thought about keeping a kid with the soul of the Kyuubi sealed inside him alive. Hikari herself had always given the kid a wide berth. It wasn't that she thought the kid was the Kyuubi, not at all. In fact, Hikari thought it was pretty blatantly obvious that he was not, seeing as there was a decided lack of violent deaths occurring around him. More than a few paint bombs, bad smells and loud noises, sure, but Hikari figured that if she was a demon who had control of a kid, she would be more than an annoying prankster, especially seeing as most of the village and civilian businesses, with the notable exception of Ichiraku's ramen, so she had heard, tended to treat him worse than a leper. No, the main reason why Hikari avoided him was that she could feel his chakra. It never felt as bad or powerful as it had the night her leg had been crushed, but it never ceased to put her on edge. It was a similar feeling that someone afraid of heights might experience when trapped in a room 10 stories up with one wall to the outside missing. Logically, so long as one avoided that missing wall like the plague, one wasn't about to fall down their deaths, and was perfectly safe. That didn't mean that one felt safe though. Hikari could have happily gone the rest of her life ignoring the kid's existence had it not been for the fact that one day when she was walking down the street pulling her cart, an orange blur came hurtling around the corner and crashed into her middle. The wind was immediately driven out of Hikari, and having not been braced for the impact, she fell hard into the dirt, and the odd angle caused her prosthetic leg to fall off and roll away from her. About to cuss out whoever had barreled into her, Hikari's first vision as she sat up was a pair of terrified blue eyes. "Gee gomenasai, I didn't mean to make your leg fall off. Hold on lady, I'll go get some help." The kid yelped. Well, she couldn't be having that. She'd never hear the end of it if a medic got dragged to her to reattach her prosthesis. Before he could dash off, Hikari lunged forward and grabbed a handful of orange jacket, raising a hand to gesture to him to wait a moment until she could get her breath back to speak. She was startled to see the immediate cringe, and the way he cowered into a shaking ball. The last time she had seen such a posture, it had been little Suba Naoki, a kid that Masaru used to play with sometimes, whose career genin drunk of a father had beaten on a regular basis until the neighbors cottoned on and informed the police. Suba Kyo had been consequently stripped of his Hite 8, and as far as Hikari was aware, Naoki had gone to live with his aunt in another village. Something in Hikari snapped at that sight. No kid should ever have that kind of reflex, no matter what. Even if he was a troublemaker. Even if he was a demon container? Hikari banished that thought. Demon container, she reminded herself. The Sandaime had said as much, and if the so-called professor of ninja, the Hokage, didn't feel threatened enough to exterminate the kid, then he must have a good reason. Besides, the kid obviously had not meant to knock her over like that. Having had a little brother, she knew quite well that children his age were appalling at hiding whether or not they were sorry about something. And it was more than that. As well as the genuine remorse, it was quite clear he was utterly terrified. For her or of her, Hikari wasn't sure, but she decided then and there that she didn't like it. "Kid," she said, touching his shoulder hesitantly as she slowly released his jacket. "You okay? Daijobu kana?" At that, the kid looked up incredulously. "Am I okay? Lady, your leg just fell off. Why won't you let me get a medic?" Hikari bit her lip to hold in the laugh that threatened to escape. No need to freak the kid out further. "Oh, don't worry, it does that sometimes. Can you go pick it up for me?" The kid scrunched his nose up in confusion, but did as he was told. He gingerly picked up the prosthesis and nearly dropped it again. "This is made out of wood," he exclaimed. Hikari snorted. This kid was a riot. "Sure is. Now can you bring it over here so I can reattach it?" The kid stared at her and handed over the prosthesis, carefully, as though it was something fragile. Hikari examined her artificial limb, and was relieved that apart from a bit of road dust, her limb seemed to be unscathed. She checked the laces around the leather cup that usually held her prosthesis on, and saw that they too were all fine. Must have just been the angle she fell at that made it pop off. Annoying, but better than having it broken. Feeling the kid's gaze on her, she looked up to see him staring at her wide-eyed. "Why is your leg made out of wood? Is it a jutsu like Mokuton?" Hikari couldn't help it, she burst out laughing. "Ha ha ha ha, oh man kid, that's a good one. No, I'm not a long-lost relative of the Shodem. I'm just a civilian missing half a leg. This is my prosthesis. Gives me something to balance on, since the original is gone." She noticed the kid was pouting a bit, and figured he thought she was laughing at him. Well, she was a bit, but she wasn't trying to be mean. "Oh, lighten up kid. It's not like it's your leg that's gone." She hiked up her skirt a little so that her stump was showing, and reattached the leg, ignoring the gawking blue eyes. "Give me a hand up out of the dirt, kid? It's harder to stand when you have to lean most of your weight on one leg." A rough, dirty little hand grasped hers, and using her crutch as a lever, Hikari managed to rise to a standing position, and began to brush the dirt off herself. She looked up at the clock tower and swore. "Damn it, now I'm late," she muttered to herself. Fortunately, her next call didn't have anyone waiting for her there, so they wouldn't care if she turned up 20 minutes after she said she would be there. She'd just have to stay a little longer than she had planned. She turned to the blonde kid. "See you later kid. Slow down a bit, or watch where you're going at least, or next time someone might get real hurt." With that, Hikari wandered off, dragging her cart behind her, unaware that despite how deserted the street had looked, the entire interaction between her and the kid had been spotted and noted. 2 days later, Hikari was shopping in the marketplace when she was shocked to receive a rather severe glare from the lady who ran the fish stall. "What?" Hikari demanded. "Don't like the smell of your own produce or something today, Harumi?" Harumi, who had sold Hikari fish for years, and who normally had a fairly good sense of humor, only glared harder. Hikari just stared back. "Alright, out with it." What did I do to offend you?" she demanded bluntly. Harumi huffed. "Word has it that you were being nice to the demon fox brat." Hikari had to resist the urge to gape. That was what this was about. Huh, and she used to have such a decent opinion of Harumi too. "Nice? Since when am I nice to anybody?" she evaded. Harumi folded her arms in front of her. Rika said Takara's boyfriend Yoshi's sister saw it. Hikari sighed. Time to do some damage control. She had nothing against the demon container personally, but on the other hand, she couldn't afford to piss off half the village. She did have to live there after all, and she had a client base to think of. "Saw what exactly? Saw me get knocked over by the brat? Saw me ask him to grab my wooden leg for me because I didn't want to have to go crawling through the dirt after it? You've known me now for how many years, Harumi? You know how much harder I find it to get back up from a fall, especially in a skirt, with my prosthesis somewhere over in the dirt." Hikari hated showing weakness, but if this was what it took to get people to shut up and mind their own business, then she was going to use every trick in her arsenal. Fortunately, Harumi thought Hikari's irritated tone was directed at the kid, as she seemed to accept her explanation of the events at face value. "Oh, how dreadful. To have that thing put you in such a humiliating situation." Harumi gushed. Hikari's mouth tightened. Now that was just unfucking called for. She was trying to keep the story as neutral as she thought it was, and here was Harumi trying to spin it into a "pity the cripple who got picked on by the nasty demon" story. Well, fuck that, Hikari thought. Then she relaxed, smiling. Harumi wanted to play that game? Okay, Hikari knew the rules. Humiliating? Oh, no, it wasn't humiliating. Irritating perhaps, but let's face it. Hikari gestured in a self-deprecating fashion. "I clean for ninjas. I'm used to a bit of rolling around in the dirt." Harumi's eyes gleamed at Hikari's accidental innuendo, and Hikari smiled back with her lips. Her eyes were cold, as she breezily continued, "Although that reminds me. Speaking of humiliation and rolling around in the dirt, I heard the most interesting rumor recently about your husband and Uyama Yuki." Harumi's smile dropped faster than fish prices during an ice shortage. "Hikari," she said in a warning tone that failed to completely hide her discomfort. Hikari might not have been the most popular person in the village, but she had connections and a reputation for saying what she honestly thought in the bluntest language possible. She also had a talent for being one of the first to know about all sorts of things. When she got home, she was going to kill her husband for putting her in this position. Hikari didn't bother to hide how little she was intimidated. "No, I have known you for years, Kawanaka Harumi, and unless you want what I know spread from one end of the village to the other, not only are you going to keep your negative opinions about anything I do to yourself, you are going to discourage other people who talk shit about me. People who work at fish stalls shouldn't call the apothecary smelly, do you understand me, Harumi?" Dumbly, the fish seller nodded, starting to look distinctly ill. Hikari nodded back. "Alright then, I'll have this one," she said, indicating a medium-sized trout. Harumi stuttered out the price, and Hikari paid it without haggling, knowing a good deal when she heard one. As she received her wrapped fish, Hikari sighed. She had originally intended not to go this direction, but screw it. It wouldn't sit right on her conscience if she did otherwise. "Oh, and Harumi?" she said, tucking the fish into her shopping bag. "What?" asked Harumi, still looking distinctly green about the gills. "Leave the kid alone. I scared him good the other day, and unless he does something specific to you, I don't want you talking up a moral outrage about him. Kid's got enough problems to deal with." Hikari left the store with her fish, knowing that that was the last time she was ever going to shop at Harumi's stall. It was after Hikari had finished her shopping that the Anbu caught up with her. Hikari was amused to note that it was Bull. She didn't see him around too often, but he had a tendency of appearing in front of her every once in a while when she was out working. She figured him letting her see him was the Anbu equivalent of saying, "Hi. Miss Hikari, the Hokage would like to speak to you," Bull said to her in a bland tone of voice. Hikari's brow creased. "The Hokage wants to speak with me? Why?" She figured that it had something to do with her work, but she had been cleaning for Ninja for almost 8 months now. What on earth had she managed to stumble on that required a meeting with the ninja leader? Bull's mask hid his face, and his body language seemed impassive. "I am unaware of the purpose of the meeting, but he would like to talk to you as soon as possible." Hikari read Bull's tone as, "now," or 5 minutes ago, but refused to be bullied. "Well, in case you hadn't noticed, Bull-san, I've just finished my shopping, and I need to get this fish in the icebox before it gets too much sun. As soon as I have squared my groceries away, I will be more than happy to meet with the Hokage," she said. "Acceptable." Bull then grabbed her arm, and before Hikari could do more than blink, she was in front of her door. "Amaterasu and the Shinigami, the hell you think you're doing?" Hikari gasped, thumping Bull on the shoulder. Well, she tried to thump him on the shoulder, but he grabbed her hand when it was centimeters away. He gave it a warning squeeze and then let her go. He could tell that there had been no malicious intent, and besides, she had done a really good job on his kitchen the other day. That didn't mean he could let a civilian actually land a hit on him though, let alone a one-legged cleaning lady. He would be laughed out of Anbu. Instead of answering Hikari, Bull just looked at her through his porcelain mask. Hikari just huffed, shaking out her hand and acknowledging his superior strength. If she had been thinking, she would never have tried that with any ninja, let alone an Anbu. Lucky he liked her. Deaths caused by civilians initiating fights with ninja were generally referred to as suicides. "Fine. Okay. Next time could you please warn me though before you do something like that?" Bull inclined his head, and Hikari decided to take that as a maybe. Having recovered from her surprise, Hikari quickly packed away her groceries, placing the vegetables and her fish in the fridge, and the dry goods in her cupboard. Idly, she wondered what Bull thought of her kitchen. It was not a particularly good advertisement of her abilities. The wooden floor needed to be swept, and there were more than a few stains and scratch marks that she hadn't bothered to patch up about the place. The fridge had previously belonged to one of Hikari's uncles, and the miscellaneous pots and pans and crockery in various stages of cleanliness had come from at least 3 different relatives, the last time Hikari had checked, and most were scorched or dinged. There was a vase of wilting daylilies in one corner, sitting in a jam jar. Bull frowned behind his mask. He had seen poorer residences before, but as far as he was aware, Hikari had clients all over the village. Going from what she had charged him when he had requested she air and dust his house out a while back, he would have figured that Hikari would be raking in the money. It was then that he heard a low coughing sound from another part of the house. "Oh, Ka-san must be awake," said Hikari. "I'll just be a moment." Bull followed Hikari as she ducked through a narrow door into a narrower corridor, watching as she knelt with some difficulty to open a sliding screen door. "Ka-san, ogenki?" Hikari asked how her mother was feeling. From the shadows of the corridor, Bull was slightly startled at the sight of Hikari's mother. Lying propped on pillows on a futon was a woman with hollowed cheeks and grayish-yellow tinged skin. The unmistakable smells of a sickroom, of dying flowers, disinfectant, stale teas and less pleasant bodily odors lingered. As he watched, the woman rolled painfully onto her side as her body was racked with a vicious hacking cough. As soon as the cough subsided, the woman struggled to sit up. Hikari helped her into a more upright position, and then handed her a cup of cold water from a jug that had been standing next to the wilting freesia that waved forlornly in a blue-glazed vase. "I'm afraid today is not a good day, Hikari," said her mother. Dark brown eyes glazed over due to illness suddenly sharpened as they spotted Bull in the shadows. "Who are you? Are you one of Hikari's customers? Come in here where I can see you." Sneaking around an old woman's sickbed, the cheek of it. Despite her apparent illness, the woman's voice was strident, albeit a little hoarse. Ducking his head a little despite himself, Bull moved so that he was standing more in the light. Hikari just shook her head. "Ka-san," her intonation fell and then rose in a light teasing scold. "You know he's not supposed to introduce himself. It'd violate some secret law of Anbu mysteriousness," she joked. Hikari turned to Bull and said, "This is my mother, Soriyama Akira." "Ka-san, I guess you can call him Bull? That's what I generally do, seems to be easier that way." Soriyama Akira sat upright amongst her pillows and bowed solemnly to Bull. "Welcome, Bull-san, to my house. Before my illness I would have insisted on offering you some tea that you would no doubt decline, but as it is, I am hardly in good enough shape to be a decent hostess." "Have you known Hikari long?" Hikari grinned. "Oh, he has. Unless there's another Bull-masked Anbu running around. He came to check what the ruckus was when I nearly got blown up by Shiranui Genma's trap first day on the job." "Did Gecko improve after all that?" Hikari asked, "or are you not allowed to tell me?" Bull inclined his head slightly. "Yes," was all he answered, with a slight smile behind his mask. Gecko had actually managed to rise as high as lieutenant, and was currently on his 5th solo Anbu mission. But he couldn't tell that to a civilian. "Oh?" Akira said. "So you and my daughter have known each other for a few months then?" "Hikari, why didn't you tell me you were spending time with such handsome men?" She winked at the bull mask, and wondered if he was blushing as red as her daughter. "Now you, behave yourself around my Hikari, or I might just have to rise out of this sick bed and give you a hiding." Bull inclined his head silently, and bowed, the gesture verging on the melodramatic. Akira was delighted. Imagine, an Anbu with a sense of humor. Hikari just rolled her eyes, and turned back to the near-skeletal form of her mother. "Do you need more of your medicine, Ka-san? More tea? More soup?" Natsuko Nisan brought over some more miso, I just saw it in the fridge. No, I am quite alright," sighed Akira. "You just missed your sister, she already force-fed me enough for one day. I'll take the medicine later. Right now my program is about to come on the radio, and I want a clear head when I'm listening." Hikari smiled sadly. "Alright Ka-san, I have to go now, but I'll be back as soon as I can." "Fine, go gallivanting about with nice young men, whilst your poor mother is trapped in bed, see if I care." Akira put the back of her hand against her forehead dramatically. Then she paused, and added acerbically, even if, good listener, best describes his communication style. "Still, you know what they say about the strong and silent type, and I'm not getting any younger, dear. You really should start working on giving me some grandchildren." Hikari groaned, pointedly didn't look at Bull, and hauled herself up from her kneeling position using the doorframe. "Yeah, sure, alright, we're leaving, bye. Have fun, dear," Akira snarked as Hikari scrambled away. Just as Bull moved to follow, the bed-ridden woman gestured for him to wait, and so he stopped. "You Anbu don't tend to make social calls. My daughter isn't in trouble, is she?" For the first time, Bull saw worry in the sick woman's eyes. "No." Bull paused. Normally he would have left it at that, but it was clear to him that his monosyllabic response was not enough to reassure her. Against his better judgment, he decided that this time, at least, he could tell an obviously dying woman enough to ease her mind. Not that it would be strictly the truth, because that would really go against the grain, but he figured that Soriyama Akira was a smart woman, and could figure out enough. The Hokage is feeling social. he told her, and wants to chat about your daughter's business. Akira's eyebrows shot up, and she seemed to ponder this for a moment, before nodding once in acknowledgement. He could tell from her expression that she had not been expecting his response. Frankly, he didn't blame her. He was surprised at himself. Fortunately, there weren't any of his comrades around to see his bad example. "Thank you, Bull-san." Akira bowed from her seated position. Naturally, Akira grinned, and Bull was struck by the sudden resemblance to her daughter. This conversation never happened. Bull grunted, "What conversation?" and then left. She heard his light tread after her daughter's thumping one, and then a light whoosh of shunshin. She would have to remind Masaru to sweep up the leaves when he got home. Sorayama Akira sat back against her pillows as her favorite radio program, a daily reading from an epic story, played, but she was only half listening to the soothing tones of Gesa Yajirai. The Hokage himself was taking an interest in her daughter's business? Interesting. Depending on what this meeting was about, and how it went, it was likely that either Hikari's little venture was doomed, or… Judging by what the Anbu had revealed, Akira had a good feeling about this. She smiled, but it was a sad smile. She knew perfectly well that Hikari had wanted to raise the money for her medicine, but even months ago, the doctors had been forthright about it only being a small chance that the medicine would help. Maybe if Tsunade had been around still, and they had caught it earlier. But even then, when it came to the limited time of such med-nins, civilians were always at the back of the queue. Doubly so if the affliction was a chronic illness instead of injury or poisoning. Akira had been visited by Dr. Takaba yesterday, and the prognosis had been grim. The prohibitively expensive medicine had had some effect, sure, but Akira's disease had been even more advanced than they had originally thought. Dr. Takaba had told her that without some sort of divine intervention she had maybe 4 months to settle her affairs. If it hadn't been for the medicine, she would have been dead months ago. Akira hadn't told her daughters and son yet. She would soon, of course. She wanted them to be prepared. She knew that Hikari especially was going to be hit hard by her death. Natsuko at least had her husband Soda to lean on, and Masaru had his genin teammates, but who did Hikari have? Family loyalty was valued in the Sorayama clan, and Kami knew Akira had enough in-laws to fill a barn. But apart from her brother-in-law Daiki and his branch, most of the family tended to treat Hikari like a mildly dangerous eccentric. Which, Akira mused, was a not completely undeserved description of her daughter, but still. Hikari, understanding that her sister Natsuko was already run off her feet caring for little Choco and Kori as well as working at that dumpling stand, and that Masaru as a genin had a heavy training and mission scheduled to keep to, had taken it upon herself to be Akira's primary caregiver as her health had declined. Akira wished it hadn't been necessary, but particularly since she had become too weak to leave her futon unaided, it was exactly that. But at least, Akira sighed, at least with this ninja cleaning business, Hikari would be able to have a livelihood. Assuming today went well, Akira would have a little to leave to her 3 children when she was gone, but she much preferred them to have secure futures. Again, Natsuko with her family and Masaru with his teammates and ninja career both had their niches carved for the foreseeable future. The ninja business was dangerous of course, and Akira worried that one day her Masaru would get in over his head and get killed, but at least he had a direction for his life, and the potential for a well-paying, well-respected job in the community. Hikari on the other hand, well, Akira supposed, worrying did little good. At this point, she could do little but hope and pray for the best. Speaking of hope, that Anbu. He had seemed oddly solicitous of her daughter, and willing to humor an old, sick woman. Completely out of character for those animal-masked specters, she thought to herself. I wonder, she muttered to herself. No matter. Things would work out, one way or the other. With that thought, she settled back against her pillows to listen to the trials of Tashi, world traveler and Lada's man, but instead began to doze. Bull's shunshin took them both to the foot of the Hokage's tower. Hikari stumbled and nearly fell flat on her face, but a hand with fingers like steel bars gripped her upper and pulled her to her feet, holding her upright until she was balanced. Thanks, Hikari gasped. Wow, that's a rush. I can see why you shinobi insist on doing that all the time. Feels like flying. Bull cocked his head, examining her, but offered no comment. Hikari just shrugged. She was used to the huge guy not talking a whole lot. Vaguely she wondered if he was the same with the mask off, but decided that it didn't matter. It was really very much none of her business. Turning to the tower, Hikari looked at the number of stairs she was going to have to go up and swore. Bull looked at her, his mask angled in what Hikari had decided was his questioning look. Don't worry about it, Hikari said, flapping one hand. Just that many stairs is going to be a bitch to get up. No, that's not what I meant. Don't even fucking think about it, Hikari snarled when Bull wordlessly offered to carry her up the stairs. I might be crippled, but that doesn't make me useless, and the day I let a flight of stairs defeat me is the day I let my Aunt Nariko have her way about the nursing home she suggested when I first lost the leg. For the record, Hikari scowled, that day will come over my dead body, so the point will be moot. And with that proclamation, Hikari began to carefully make her way up the stairs, using the banister on one side and her crutch on the other to swing herself upwards step by step, putting as little weight on her prosthesis as possible. Bull followed behind her, and Hikari decided to pretend that he was just doing his job as escort, as opposed to making sure she didn't need the help that she'd refused. Even if she did stumble, she would refuse. She'd make her way up those stairs alone if she had to crawl. About 10 minutes later, having been stopped a few times by paperwork nin who had wanted to know what the hell a civilian was doing in the tower, Hikari, slightly breathless from exertion, had simply pointed at the massive masked presence at her back, and most of them had paled and backed away slowly. They were finally at the Hokage's door. Bull pushed past Hikari and entered with only a perfunctory knock. Hikari followed closely behind him. Hikari had never seen the Hokage up close before. She could recognize him, obviously, considering that his face took up a significant proportion of the mountainside, and his official robes were pretty distinctive. But the closest she had ever been to this man was most of a room away when her little brother Masaru had graduated the academy. This was a man, she reminded herself, who was called the Professor, because he knew and could perform a ridiculous amount of jutsu. This was a man who had been given the job as Hokage because he was the strongest of all the shinobi of his generation. She had to remind herself because frankly, the Hokage looked pretty old and tired, as he sat hunched over and squinted over his paperwork through slightly battered-looking reading glasses. He was almost as old as her grandfather, and she had little doubt that the man had seen and heard enough to age him a century past that. It was a quietly held opinion of many of the civilians that ninja years were like dog years. Hikari, as a 17-year-old civilian, was only now beginning to escape being treated like a child, whilst 12-year-old genin were allowed into bars. It was a badly kept secret that a significant proportion of the kunoichi classes were devoted to instilling in the girls how to have safe in missions and out of them. The lessons covered hygiene, contraception, and psychology so that careers would not end prematurely due to the girls' growing feelings for clients, falling accidentally pregnant to their usually male teammates, or any of the other pitfalls that could arise from the new experiences of hormones coupled with lax rules at home and often death-defying missions abroad. Kunoichi had to walk a delicate tightrope of exercising self-control and looking out for when their generally less mature male peers were about to get themselves into trouble. There was a reason after all why there were girls on every genin team. But the real reason why the genin were allowed such privileges over their civilian peers came down to the simple fact that otherwise they might not ever enjoy them. Teenagers were known for risk-taking behaviors. In between the permissiveness of the laws concerning child soldiers, might as well let the brats take what little pleasure while they still can, was a common sentiment, and it was hard to consider anyone with 1,000-yard stare to be still a child, no matter that they still had puppy fat. The universal brutality of the only exam genin could take outside of wartime that would allow them promotion, and the fact that any mission that a shinobi took could easily be their last due to bad intel, bad decisions, or just bad luck. The likelihood of ninja dying or being permanently crippled in their first 5 years of service was 1 in 3. This had only gotten worse since the legendary medic Nin Tsunade had left, and the general standards of the Konoha hospital had henceforth dropped noticeably, and so the likelihood of ninja surviving the first 5 years along with their original genin teammates was even lower. So when ninja reached the age of 21, it was more than just marker of coming of age like it was for the civilians. Civilians who turned 21 would often have large parties with their friends and family. Ninja who turned 21 were generally quietly acknowledged as being by default worthy of registering in the bingo books of other nations, regardless of known exploits. Sometimes especially if they had no known exploits. A ninja who had reached 21 without drawing the notice of the various competing intelligence services of the hidden villages was sometimes either stupidly lucky, or kept close to home due to their lack of skill and/or politics. But sometimes, it was because they were just that good. In any case, because of the dangers and stresses of the shinobi way of life, if it was rare for a full genin team to reach the age of 21 and still be at combat efficiency, unscathed, was not a word that anyone with any sense would apply to a shinobi who had been active for almost a decade. It was even rarer for them to grow old enough to have grandchildren. That was the other reason why the Hokage was called the Professor. He had taught the Sannin, and regardless of what personal flaws and strengths that Jiraiya, Tsunade and Orochimaru had shown, they would not have become the awe-inspiring ninja they were without their teacher. The Hokage was the rarest type of genius in the ninja world, one that had managed to produce students that had a diverse set of specializations, and that had managed to live up to the strength of their mentor. That said as much about Sarutobi Hiruzen as it did about his students. Thus, even if the Hokage was past his prime, there was little doubt the man was a living legend. Not to mention his position as leader of an organization that routinely organized assassinations, theft and espionage, alongside the innocently innocuous D-ranks that were the public face of shinobi missions. Hikari, not being a complete idiot, decided to show the old man as much respect as she could muster without feeling like a toady. She respected the Hokage, and was more than happy to show it, but at the same time, her experience with watching civilian, ninja interactions was that ninjas were generally suspicious or contemptuous of obsequiousness. Bowing her head politely, she silently waited for the Sandame to acknowledge her presence. She didn't have long to wait. "Greetings Soriyama Hikari-san. If you could please take a seat, I will be with you in just a moment," the Sandame Hokage said without looking up as he stamped one of the pieces of paperwork he had laid out in front of him. Hikari nodded, "Yes Hokage-sama," and moved to drag a chair over from the wall. She figured that the shinobi must usually give their reports standing up, because there were no impressions in the carpet to imply that the chair usually rested in front of the Hokage's desk. Before she could do so, however, Bull blurred, and then whisked the chair so that it was suddenly in front of her. Forgetting who she was in front of for a moment, Hikari growled, "Damn it Bull. I could have got it fine for myself." Bull just shrugged, obviously unapologetic. Hikari rolled her eyes, and sat down on the chair a little harder than necessary. It broke beneath her, and then suddenly, she was lying on the floor, in a mess of chair parts. "Son of a bitch," she swore, kicking herself free and then levering herself up using the Hokage's desk. At least this time her prosthesis hadn't fallen off, even though her crutch had gone flying. "Are you alright Miss Hikari?" Bull suddenly boomed, at her elbow in an instant. Hikari blinked. She had never heard Bull sound like that before. Normally he was so restrained and quiet. Had her fall broken his iron control? Why? Holding onto the edge of the Hokage's desk for support, she checked herself over, fixing her clothes a little as she went. She shook her head. "It was just a nasty surprise, Bull. I'm fine. I am extremely sorry about that." Hikari jumped. She hadn't even noticed the Hokage move, and he was suddenly right beside her, looking her up and down, before nodding and moving to check the chair. Looking at the pieces, it was pretty obvious that the chair had been sabotaged. The brakes in the legs had clean saw marks. The Hokage made a sound of severe annoyance. "That boy," he grumbled to himself. He looked up at the ceiling, and growled out, "Anbu, report." A short Anbu with a green ponytail that matched her frog mask flipped down from the ceiling. "Hokage-sama." Hikari looked sidelong at the Hokage, and was not surprised to see that his expression was fixed on, very unimpressed indeed. She swallowed hard, silently, and was glad that she wasn't Frog. "Could you please explain to me why the chair that I use for visitors and injured shinobi has been sabotaged? Without you, or any of the other Anbu guarding my office noticing?" The Hokage had an expression that suggested it was only his iron control that was preventing him from yelling at one of his elite forces in front of a civilian. Judging by the extreme tension that Hikari could see in Frog's stance, Hikari got the impression that he might as well have. The Anbu hesitated, before answering, "The only person who has been in your office today without supervision was Uzumaki. But I only took my eyes off him for like 5 minutes." The Anbu's words could have been interpreted as whining, but the tone suggested more impressed incredulity. Hikari knew that she was impressed, despite the fact that she was still a bit sore from hitting the floor like that. No kid she'd ever heard of had been able to get one past Anbu like that, especially one that wasn't even out of the academy yet. The Hokage face palmed. "Oh Naruto," he groaned. He then looked up and snapped at the Anbu. "Well, what are you waiting for? Bring him here. I want him in front of my desk 5 minutes ago." He raised one hand as if to wave it in dismissal, but then paused. "Intact. I want him in front of my desk 5 minutes ago intact." Then he waved dismissively. The Anbu hesitated for a split second, but then looked at the Hokage and Bull, visibly resisted cringing away from the latter, who had cocked his mask in the way that somehow expressed well. "What are you waiting for?" An engraved invitation. And then hastily shunshined away. The Hokage shook his head, muttering darkly under his breath, before he turned to Hikari, and said, "My apologies, Soriyama-san." Hikari shrugged. "No harm done. It's not the first time I've hit the ground and it won't be the last." She shook her head a little ruefully, and accepted her crutch back from Bull, who had picked it up for her. "It's not even the first time that kids knocked me down this week." The Hokage sighed. "Yes, I did hear about that incident. As I am sure you are aware, your cousin, council member Soriyama Wakana, has threatened to file an assault case on your behalf." Hikari gaped, honestly surprised. "Wait, what?" The Hokage's gaze sharpened as he nodded to himself. "So the rumors are true then?" Hikari just stared at him, and then pushed away from the desk, hobbling over to one of the wide windows so that she could lean against the sill, ignoring the hand that Bull offered her for support. She took a moment to compose herself, considered the last few minutes, and then realized what was going on. "Politics," she audibly groaned. The Hokage and Bull, who had been silently watching her, both looked askance. Hikari massaged her forehead with one hand. "Okay, so let me see if I've got this straight. This meeting isn't about my business at all. You ninja haven't felt the need to do more than keep an eye on me since I got set up 6 months ago, and I haven't woken up in some dank cell in the basement of T&I, so obviously I'm not in trouble for something I've done." Hikari took a breath. "On the other hand, the fact that I'm here means that I've gone and stumbled into something important, haven't I? This is about the kid?" Something in what she had just said made the Hokage's eyebrows raise almost imperceptibly, but he merely nodded. There was a pause, and then Hikari belatedly realized that the Hokage wanted her to keep going. "Oh, right. Well, since you mentioned rumors, then I assume that it's got around that I didn't exactly spit at the poor kid even though he knocked me over. Hell, you probably had some Anbu getting eyewitness reports just out of general policy like 5 seconds after it happened." The Hokage outright laughed. "You overestimate the abilities of Anbu's information gathering." Hikari just snorted. "Sure I do. Let's both pretend that you don't have Anbu watching the kid 24/7. Let's pretend that you're really that stupid." She looked up and blanched a little at the Hokage's suddenly harsh expression, and the sudden feeling that his chakra was going to crush her. She sank abruptly to the floor, but this time no one made any effort to help her up. "Explain your statement." The words were relatively mild, but Hikari had sudden visions of that dank cell in T&I. Shit. Her mother had always told her that her mouth would get her into trouble. Hikari gasped, trying to refill her lungs with air, and raised both hands in the universal gesture of, "Unarmed civilian here. Seriously, I know you could squish me like a bug, but I'd personally prefer if we could both go our merry ways unscathed." Whoa. What did I say? Look, obviously you have someone tasked to keep an eye on the kid. I can't say why, obviously, without breaking the law, but you wouldn't have that law there if you weren't trying to keep his condition secret or something from outsiders. If no one is allowed to bring it up, then Konoha's enemies are less likely to learn about the fact that we've got a thing I will not be talking about. So on the one hand, this could be just you wanting the kid to live to puberty. On the other, this means that when the kid gets a bit bigger, Konoha's got a secret weapon that our enemies can't be sure that we have. Unless they open their eyes and notice how most people either treat the kid like he's a leper, or are openly hostile, which come to think of it is another good reason to have someone keeping an eye on him. Hikari babbled. "Now, please don't kill me. We can't afford Mum's medicine on just Masaro's genin pay." Slowly, the feeling of being crushed ebbed, and Hikari opened eyes that she hadn't even realized she had closed while she cringed. When all that she heard was silence, she looked up warily. The Hokage's expression was still blank, but she couldn't help but feel that she was being assessed. Assessed on what? Hikari felt a familiar evil presence, and shuddered. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a small orange-clad figure was thrown in. He rolled a little, and hit the Hokage's desk, crumpling with a small moan. Hikari was shocked for a split second, but when the kid dazedly blinked his eyes open, she saw red. Ignoring the fact that she was crouched on the floor, Hikari turned to look at the Anbu who had just unceremoniously thrown an 8-year-old child into a desk, standing to smug attention next to the door like a dog waiting for a pat on the head from master and a biscuit for being a good girl. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" Hikari demanded, attempting to struggle to her feet. She heard a sharp rustle as the Hokage's head suddenly snapped around to stare at her again, but ignored it. The Anbu, who was still Frog, Hikari noticed, just stared at her through the holes of her mask. Seriously, Hikari made it to her feet by hauling herself up by the windowsill and stood straight and defiant. "I know violence is what you're trained for, but since when do Anbu throw kids into furniture for no apparent reason?" If Hikari hadn't known better, she would have thought that the Anbu just blinked at her. "The civilian does make a very good point," drawled the Hokage, his sarcasm especially pointed on the word, civilian. "Please someone correct me if I am wrong, but I am fairly sure I asked you to bring me Naruto intact." The Anbu's smug attitude vanished. "We'll be speaking of this later," the Hokage growled. "For now, you are dismissed." Frog bowed, and then vanished. Hikari, having regained most of her equilibrium, noticed that the kid was still sitting on the floor looking a little out of it. She hobbled over to him, and poked him with her crutch, avoiding touching him as much as she could. "Hey kid, you okay?" The kid shook his head as though to clear it, making his blonde hair flop all over the place. He looked up at Hikari. "Oh hey, you're the lady with the cool fake leg." Hikari blinked. No one had ever said her wooden prosthesis was cool before. "Naruto, haven't I told you to be polite to strangers?" The Hokage sighed in exasperation. "Sure old man, but fake leg lady isn't a stranger. We met before." Bright blue eyes looked innocently up at Hikari, silently asking her to confirm his story, completely missing the point. Hikari spotted the resigned look on the Hokage's face and snickered. "You call it like you see it, don't you kid?" Hikari said, ignoring the Hokage's assessing look. "Seriously, what was this? A job interview? Wait a second. Hang on." Hikari whirled on the Hokage with wide eyes. No fucking way, I'm sorry, but I can't do it." "Can't do what?" the Hokage asked her calmly. "Whatever it is that you want me to do with the kid, my answer is no." "Shit." Hikari ran her fingers through her hair. "Look, I'm sympathetic to the kid's plight and all, but I can't be associated with him any more than I already am. I'm already persona non grata in enough places just because of a rumor. Which admittedly is based on truth, because I don't kick puppies, no matter what they—" Hikari visibly bit back her words, knowing that had she continued, she would have broken the Hokage's decree. The Hokage just watched her, his expression carefully blank. He seemed to have decided to let Hikari talk herself out before he made any proposals. The kid looked up at her, eyes wide with confusion, and a little dawning hurt. Hikari winced. And she just said that she didn't kick puppies. Apparently she had just made herself a liar, since the puppy was apparently smart enough to know when the grown-ups were talking about him. She turned to the kid, ignoring the Hokage for the moment, and the roiling nausea that rose in her stomach at the feel of the kid's chakra. "Look kid, it's nothing personal, and frankly, it's really unfair, but—" "Why do you call me, kid?" The kid interrupted her. Hikari blinked. "Huh? Why do you call me, kid?" The kid repeated himself. Hikari frowned a little. Because you are one?" she said. But everyone calls me a demon, or fox brat, or something. Unless they call me Naruto. Or Uzumaki, but only the old man and the masked people call me that." The kid trailed off. Hikari bit her lip. It wasn't that she didn't get exactly where those people were coming from and all, but still, didn't the kid have anyone who treated him like a human being? The Hokage and the Anbu couldn't count the Hokage, no matter how much he might personally like the kid, would have to be aware of his potential as a weapon and the politics that would surround his every action, whereas the Anbu were almost definitely acting on orders. Even if they weren't, Hikari thought to herself, it wasn't like they'd be allowed to interact with the kid in more than a bare minimum fashion anyway, since it was well known that Anbu were supposed to be emotionless tools as soon as they put on the masks. If nothing else, they had a reputation to keep up, but also, Anbu were not supposed to get close to people when they were masked. It was a bad idea for a number of reasons, not the least that they were supposed to be detached and anonymous from their Anbu identities.